I was a protester. Now, I don't consider myself having I can't think of the word I want to use, the character of a protester. But I went. Now, I was part of a strike when I was in my 20s, when Southwestern Bell went on strike, and I was out there for like 2 hours. Can you hear me okay, you think? We're just going to go ahead?
A little higher.
Want me to be a little bit louder? Okay, all right, put on my preacher voice. 6 years ago, I went to protest House Bill 2719 at the state capitol. I was at Lecompton and I just drove over to Topeka. The bill, if passed, was going to affect rural libraries and the interlibrary loan system in Kansas. The bill could also have affected rural fire departments, rural hospitals, and other resources needed by rural Kansas. I wanted to be there to hear the speeches. I knew that I wasn't going to talk, but I wanted to be in the room to hear the speeches. Unfortunately, I parked and I walked around the whole Capitol building trying to figure out how to get in. And by the time I got in on the elevator up to the 5th floor, the room was full. And I had to stay outside in the hallway, and there were a lot of us out there. We got to hear a few of the words of the speakers. There was only one person that was for the bill and everyone else was against it. And I was glad of that. I signed in as an interested and present party, and I did get to talk to a few folks that came out of the room. So I was really glad that I went. I haven't been to a protest since, but that doesn't mean I'm not a protester in my heart. All of us in this room are protesters of sorts. All of us who claim a Protestant faith. Protestant, of course, comes from protest. It comes from the protest of those involved in the Reformation of the 16th century, which was a splitting away from the Catholic Church. The general understanding is that the Protestant Reformation began in 1517 when Luther published his 95 Theses as a reaction against the selling of indulgences by the church. The buying of indulgences was a way to buy one's forgiveness for sin. So we all have protesting in our spiritual DNA. I kind of like that idea. We have protesting in our spiritual DNA. It's how we Protestants came to be. Have you ever considered Jesus to be a protester, though? About 6 years ago, I heard a woman in the church I was serving at the time say, Jesus was a rebel? Jesus was a protester? It made no sense to her in her head at all. We don't usually think of him in that way. If we read the Gospels all the way through, or just pick a gospel, any gospel, we can see it, that Jesus was a protester. The term protester, I know, can bring up strong emotions, strong opinions, depending on who we're talking to and the context of the conversation. The word can invoke irritation, annoyance, even anger. Protesting can be used for ugly and horrific purposes. We know we've seen that in the last year or so. It can be used to motivate anger and hate, violence, vengeance. And we've seen this on TV. Myself, I was thinking of the Westboro Baptist Church and the KKK. And then, of course, the insurrection of January 6th. Too often, protesting is not used often enough by good people, by followers of Jesus. To be a Christian and to be a protester seems to be opposites. Jesus was very good at protesting, though. Sometimes Jesus did it quietly, and other times he was inflammatory, provocative, and publicly disruptive. He was, no doubt, a radical. He was eventually arrested, beaten, and sacrificed on a cross because of his words and his actions. We honor Jesus for who he was. This is true. It's also true that his protesting caught the attention of those in power, both politically and in the religious realm. He would have died, anyone would have died, who was caught protesting the way Jesus did. Throughout the New Testament, we see how Jesus purposefully intervened, spoke up, and was present in various situations in order to protest, dissent, demonstrate, object, question, defend, revolt, and challenge. And I'm going to give you a few examples. We know the story of Jesus storming into the temples in the court, in the temple courts in John 2:13 through 25. He interrupted the proceeding by overturning tables, yelling, and driving people out by using a whip. In the Message, in that translation, the passage calls the money changers who were selling sheep and cattle and doves loan sharks. And Jesus is calling out, "Get your things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a shopping mall." I love that. I mean, that makes sense to us. Get out of here. Don't turn God's house into a shopping mall. Jesus was condemning the greed and corruption of religious hypocrites because Jesus was a protester. There's a story in Luke 4:16 to 31 of Jesus boldly standing and speaking in the synagogue, proclaiming things so countercultural and radical, things like, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." His words were so inflammatory that a mob eventually chased him with the intent of killing him because Jesus was a protester. Jesus took his message to the masses, speaking and advocating where he could. In Matthew 4, verses 23 through 25, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness among the people. His fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. Jesus created a movement based on justice, on hope and love, because Jesus was a protester. Jesus gained fame from those who were oppressed. In Luke 5:15 it says, "But now more than ever the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds would gather to hear him and to be cured of their diseases." He also gained notoriety from those in power because of all the things he did, because Jesus was a protester. In Mark 2, verses 1 through 12, we can read the story of the paralytic man brought to Jesus and lowered through the roof. When Jesus saw these men's faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." But some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus confronted them, asking, "Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'?" And to prove his authority on earth, Jesus commanded the man to stand up, take your mat, and go to your home. Jesus confronted leaders about their wrong practices, their evil thoughts, and their destructive deeds because Jesus was a protester. Jesus asked people to follow him and to join his cause because Jesus was a protester. In John 5, Jesus came across a man who had been laying beside a pool called Bethesda for 38 years, and Jesus healed him. We also know that the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. Mark 3, verses 1 through 6, is the story of Jesus and the man with a withered hand. Healing this man on the Sabbath caused the Pharisees to conspire against him and figure out how to destroy him. Jesus broke the religious expectations and the laws of the day to the point that people wanted him to die because Jesus was a protester. In Matthew 11, 20 through 30, Jesus openly rebuked, held accountable, challenged, and called out people who refused to change from their misguided ways because Jesus was a protester. And I can go on. In Luke 7, we read about the centurion with such great faith that his slave was healed. There's the dead son who was healed for the sake of his widowed mother. He accepted the woman who anointed him with oil, no matter her reputation, and there were others. Jesus emphasized and advocated for the oppressed, the hurt, the abused, the downtrodden, the abandoned, the alienated, the victimized, because Jesus was a protester. Jesus was viciously mocked, challenged, scrutinized, slandered, ridiculed, besmirched, and discredited by authorities and religious leaders because Jesus was a protester. Jesus created, inspired, and sent out other protesters because that's what protesters do. These other protesters were eventually arrested and killed because they too were protesters. Jesus went to places he wasn't supposed to go and talked with people he wasn't supposed to talk to, like the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. He did this because Jesus was a protester. How much more of this can you take this morning? Have you got the idea? Jesus stood before a mob that was ready to kill a woman, intervening on her behalf, saving her life, because Jesus was a protester. Jesus devoted his life to speaking, to helping, supporting, defending, empowering, healing, freeing, and loving everyone, especially those who were in desperate need from the hands of the oppressors, from the rulers, the officials, the mobs, and those who intended to harm, kill, and destroy, because he was a protester. Throughout his life, Jesus protested and brought awareness about gender inequality, religious hypocrisy, political corruption, racism, hate, segregation, empowerment, and social injustice. He humbly sacrificed and served to advocate for the outcast. He protected the poor. He sheltered the homeless, uplifted the exploited, showed hospitality to strangers, energized the weary, and loved humanity. Jesus was mocked, ridiculed, abused, intimidated, arrested because he dared to become a protester. Eventually, we know he was arrested and put on trial, and then publicly humiliated, mocked, and severely tortured. It was in this context where his greatest demonstration of protest happened, dying on the cross, where God in human form proved to the world that love trumps fear, grace trumps revenge, mercy trumps cruelty, generosity trumps selfishness, hope trumps negativity, and God trumps all. Will we be bold enough to speak out against, act against, protest against these kinds of sins that Jesus spoke out against? Contrary to what we may have been taught or think about righteousness and holiness, sometimes the most Christ-like thing that we can do is to protest. Christianity isn't about political power, military might, safety, wealth, control, fame, or comfort. It's about doing as Christ did. It's true that the disciples after Jesus departed, were martyred for being divine protesters, just like Jesus was. Jesus protested for the sake of humanity, for the people loved by and created in the image of God. Are we willing to do the same? And you know, I think going on Etsy and buying an article created by an artist in the Ukraine is a form of protesting. I think, or renting an Airbnb and not going. Renting from somebody in the Ukraine is a protest. This is the first Sunday of Lent, And this is a little stronger message than what I usually share this early in Lent. I think that what's happening on the world stage, especially between Ukraine and Russia, led me to this message this morning. What might we be called to do in the coming days, weeks, months, hopefully not years? I don't know how to answer that question, except for the few ideas that we've shared here, and being open to other possible ideas. I do believe that Lent is an opportune time for Christians to slow down and ponder our Christian walk, our Christian faith, to allow God to take our lives and let them be consecrated. May we set ourselves aside, set some time aside, and think about who we are and whose we are. I hope you all picked up a handout. I love this title, Reinvent Your Lent. Reinvent Your Lent. So often people give something up for Lent. They give up chocolate or coffee or gossiping, or in this little square there's alcohol and chips and pizza and carbs and shame and other things that people give up. I think sometimes we need to add something to our lives. Especially if we give something up, we have time and energy to add something to our lives. And these are some ideas of some things to add to your life. There's the 40 days equals 40 items. The idea is that every day in Lent, we take one thing from our home that we don't use, or that doesn't fit us, that we're just done with, and put it in a bag. And then take it to a charity, to a clothes closet, to some ministry that could use these items. And at the end of Lent, our house will be a little bit freer. There'll be a little more space for us. In the lower left-hand corner, a photo a day. Now, I'm not a photographer. Photos have never been real important to me. So I've decided, instead of taking a photo for each one of these ideas, I've decided to try to think of something in my life that matches these words, or even to journal sometimes on these words. March 2nd, the first day, Ash Wednesday, the word was full, and I thought, my refrigerator's full, and I'm thankful for that. I'm very thankful for that. The second day was tempted, and my idea was, gosh, I was tempted to crawl back in bed. It wasn't made yet. I was so tempted to crawl back in. On March 4th, the word is alone, and I live alone, and I eat alone, and those don't have to they don't have to be negative. They can be a time of awareness of what I'm eating and people that I'd like to have at my table. There are a lot of ways to think about. Today's word is protect, and I hear Vanita over here talking about protecting the children, wanting to protect the children. So my prayer today could be for protecting the children. So that's one. Those you can take pictures or think about these words that were given. Those are two ways. There might be some other way. Draw a picture, paint a picture, talk to somebody about these. There are many ways those could be used. In the bottom right-hand corner, there's a list of things to give up for Lent and a list of things to take up for Lent. And originally, I didn't have enough room, but they were side by side. So if we give up anger, we can take up happiness. If we give up bitterness, we can take up joy. If we give up conceit, we can take up humility, and so on through the list. So these are just some ideas of ways to be more intentional during the Lenten season and to let God take our lives and consecrate them, which is our hymn after the message. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, for thee. And it's number